Welcome to the Explainer. If you've ever found yourself wondering how your brain is actually physically wired to daydream, well, you are definitely in the right place. Today, we're going to decode the highly complex anatomy of the default mode network. We're taking decades of dense neuroimaging data and translating it into a clean, easy-to-remember anatomical blueprint. Let's get started. So what is your brain actually doing when it's doing absolutely nothing? It's a highly relatable question, right? We usually think of resting as this state where the brain just sort of powers down. But as we're about to see today, when you stop focusing on the outside world, a massive, highly organized network inside your brain actually powers up.
Think of this agenda as our transit map for today's Explainer. We'll be hitting 5 stops. 1. The accidental brain discovery. 2. Mapping the 3 hubs. 3. The memory subsystem. 4. Interwoven networks. And 5. Why the network matters.
Okay, section 1, the accidental brain discovery. To really understand this, we have to start our tour back in the 1970s. Researchers back then weren't actually looking for a daydreaming network at all. They just needed a control state, a quiet brain, to compare against brains that were doing complex math or reading. But looking at David Ingvar's early hyperfrontal blood flow map here, he noticed something totally shocking. When subjects were left completely alone in a quiet room, their frontal brain regions were burning through high amounts of energy. He realized the brain is literally never idle. It is doing heavy biological work precisely when we think it's doing nothing. And later, PET scans in the 1990s proved that these specific regions actually deactivate the exact moment you start paying attention to a task. The real estate this network takes up is fascinating because it entirely avoids the primary sensory cortices and instead occupies the higher-order association cortices. If you map it out, the default mode network is positioned as far away from incoming sensory information as biologically possible. It honestly doesn't care about what you're seeing, hearing, or touching right now. It operates in the deep association areas, those parts of the cerebral cortex that evolved much later in hominid history to process really complex internal thoughts. Moving on to section 2, mapping the 3 hubs. Let's build our anatomical city map and focus on the major command centers. The anatomy here is anchored by a strict rule of 3. Seriously, if you want to remember the core structure of the default mode network, just commit these 3 main hubs to memory. First, the medial prefrontal cortex, or MPFC, right up at the front. Second, the posterior cingulate cortex, or PCC, situated right along the posterior midline. And third, the inferior parietal lobule, or IPL, located on the sides of the brain. Practically all the other regions we're going to talk about effectively report back to these 3 major command centers. Looking at this functional connectivity map, you can clearly spot those 3 distinct hubs. You've got the red zones highlighting the IPL on the sides, and the MPFC and PCC sitting prominently along the midline. Now, notice how these red areas are tightly correlated. When one hub fires, the others fire perfectly in sync. This built-in functional connectivity is exactly what allowed researchers to officially define these regions not just as random, isolated dots, but as an integrated, interacting network. All right, section 3, the memory subsystem. Think of this as the brain's data archive. Let's see how information actually feeds into those hubs. Every time you kind of time travel through your own memories, well, you are relying on the medial temporal lobe subsystem, which heavily includes the hippocampal formation and parahippocampal cortex. It's essentially gathering fragments of your past experiences, facts, associations, and feeding all that raw data right up into those 3 main anatomical hubs we just looked at. You can really see the whole architecture taking shape here. The major hubs in red are interacting super tightly with the memory subsystem in blue. See how the nodes in the red cluster, our PCC, MPFC, and IPL, are heavily linked with those thick black lines. But look over to the right. The blue nodes represent the hippocampal and parahippocampal regions. They have their own distinct tight-knit community, but they project strong connection lines directly into the red hubs. It's definitive proof that the default mode network isn't just one big blob, it's a sophisticated system made of distinct communicating modules. Which brings us to section 4, interwoven networks. Get ready for a major 2019 plot twist. For the longest time, we just assumed the default mode network was one giant monolithic system. Actually, scratch that. When researchers recently zoomed in on single individuals using incredibly high-resolution scans, they found its multiple interwoven networks. They call them DNA and DNB. By moving away from averaging group data and looking closely at single individuals, neuroscientists realized those 3 command center hubs aren't uniform at all. The blue and yellow areas show completely distinct functional networks that are intensely interdigitated. They literally wrap around each other like marble dough along the brain's surface in midline. This level of granular detail totally reshaped how we understand the resting brain.
The crucial takeaway from this quote is that these separate, juxtaposed networks act as specialized subway lines handling completely different domains of internally constructed thought. So, while the whole system is detached from the outside world, one subnetwork might be dedicated specifically to retrieving a childhood memory, while the adjacent interwoven network is totally specialized for inferring what someone else is thinking in a social situation. It is just an astonishing level of specialization hiding right beneath the surface of a wandering mind.
Finally, Section 5, Why the Network Matters. Let's step back and look at the clinical relevance of all this. So why does mapping this complex anatomy actually matter to you or to medical science? Well, understanding these specific hubs is absolutely critical because disruptions here are directly linked to devastating cognitive disorders, things like Alzheimer's, schizophrenia, and autism. For example, the sheer metabolic activity that makes the default mode network so powerful also seems to make it really vulnerable over time. In Alzheimer's, the network's core hubs, especially that posterior cingulate cortex we mapped out, are among the very first areas to show reduced activity and plaque buildup. In schizophrenia, we see dysregulation in how these internal networks interact with external reality. So mapping the anatomy isn't just about understanding daydreams, it's the absolute foundation for understanding cognitive decline and psychiatric health. Ultimately, the network serves this incredible evolutionary purpose. It acts as a life simulator to help you plan for tomorrow while you're resting today. By pulling memories from that hippocampal subsystem and processing them in the prefrontal and parietal hubs, your brain allows you to rehearse complex social interactions, anticipate danger, and vividly envision your own future. That mental simulation, that's the real evolutionary superpower granted by the specific anatomy. So, the next time you catch yourself daydreaming, remember that doing nothing is biologically one of the most highly organized, complex tasks your brain ever performs. You're activating an intricately interwoven, highly evolved set of anatomical hubs running millions of mental simulations. I really hope this explainer has given you a newfound appreciation for the incredible architecture behind your wandering mind. I'll leave you with this. Where will your default mode network take you next? Keep exploring, and thanks so much for learning with me today.